And some of you used the hand raise feature when you were ready to speak, so I will honor that. And we are going to end today's session directly at 1 o'clock, so we have a little bit of less time for the responders to speak.
I can't turn on my camera. It says the host has stopped it.
Oh, I'll see if I can help you with that. Felicia, I see that your hand is up.
Thanks so much, Laura. Thank you to all the presenters. Fascinating and truly riveting. Like I felt like I could not keep up with all the notes that I wanted to take. So thank you all so much. There are some things that Victoria, thanks for really teeing us up here in terms of the framework and language that we're using. Meryl, I was really struck by the notion you were talking about in terms of joking on Twitter. And as a psychologist, I've really struggled with the proliferation of social media in general, because I feel like it has led to a decrease in interpersonal dialogue and a decrease in conflict management and the skills that folks need to practice in order to engage in those in a healthy way. I've also felt that increase in social media has led to an increase in isolation, because people feel like they are connected to people through social media. But I would contend that that interaction through social media is one-sided and isn't actually an interaction. It's a monologue. And so I really struggle with the proliferation of social media and the impact on our interpersonal communication. And that to me is directly connected to the political partisanship that we see on a national level. And I've had folks ask me before, is it really as partisan in Lansing as we're feeling on the national level? And what's interesting is that I will say in my everyday work, it is not. So I'm a Democrat. I work with my colleagues across the aisle all the time on both funding, so appropriations, and also policy work. And we all know that, the folks who I work with and who I choose to work with, we don't agree on everything, but there are things that overlap that we do agree on, and we really focus on those things. But I think that part of what social media allows folks to do, and I alluded to this in my previous comments, was to take cognitive shortcuts, because what social media does is really simplify very complex concepts and discussions that need to happen to, I don't even know how many characters Twitter can be. Meryl, you probably can tell me, 150 or something like that. And so we have totally gotten away from being able to have an intentional kind of dialogue that would actually, I think, help break down some of the partisanship that we may feel the press of. The second thing that I wanted to comment on was actually your presentation. I really liked a lot. And I had a question and a comment. My comment was, I wonder if you were talking about with QAnon growing during COVID because of the political polarization, but I also wonder if it grew because of people being isolated from one another. And that was also another big factor, and maybe I just missed it, maybe you said that. But then the other question that I had was, you talked about in some of the convergence culture and things becoming more crazy town. I was also wondering if there were less characters used in that kind of information that you saw that you considered more crazy town, in thinking about what Meryl was talking about in terms of Twitter. So I had that was just a question that I had. And then finally, in terms of Andrea, we are seeing reproductive rights as a battlefield here in Michigan right now. I mean, that is what we are seeing. We're in the middle of living that. We have a proposition on our ballot in November because we had the Dobbs decision come out on June 24th. And so it's been fascinating to see what is happening again in terms of national rhetoric versus individual values. And what we're seeing, we had over 62,000 folks reach out to the ACLU to help to gather signatures to be able to put this amendment on the ballot. And although we needed around 425,000 signatures to be able to do that, the ACLU turned in over 750,000 signatures. I mean, literally they had to turn away petition signatures, folks who wanted to help with that because they had so many folks. And so I agree with you that I think that, this is ripe for a battleground, but I will also tell you again, with the difference between, the national kind of narrative and working with my Republican colleagues, literally had a Republican colleague come to me and say, hey, Felicia, we both know the data that around 70% of folks want to be able to have reproductive health care and abortion legal. And, I know that on my side, we can get kind of extreme, and sometimes on your side that, that can happen too. Can we sit down and talk about this and figure out a way for our state to talk about it? And I said, of course, I'm always happy to do that. And so there's also this, again, I think, this discrepancy between the national rhetoric and what is happening on the floors in the chambers in our state governments, when people get to know each other and have relationships where they can have these really important nuanced discussions.
Thank you so much, Felicia. Tim, I'm curious if you have a response, any response to Victoria's presentation. She had mentioned your work.
Absolutely. First of all, thank you for mentioning the report. There's one thing that's not directly the report, that's my personal experience from my own story, but also my work as a practitioner with my exit work, where I help people leave extremist environments. We worked with former white supremacists. We worked with gang members coming out of black gangs here in the Memphis metro area, but also with former jihadists. These stories are always very, very similar. The reasons are not always the same, but the way is very similar. And she talked about that radicalization and also de-radicalization take time. It doesn't happen overnight. It always looks like this. And I believe the other panelists mentioned it, for example, with QAnon, or also the COVID problem with COVID deniers and so on. These were normal people, sometimes family members, that overnight seemingly came up with these out-of-the-world conspiracy theories. And we had no idea, where's this coming from? And it looked always overnight. And for me, in my own radicalization process back then, when I was a teenager, it must have looked for my mother the same way. When I came home, identifiable as a white supremacist, and she was like, what happened to my son overnight? What's often behind the scenes happening is a slow radicalization process. That can be, I encourage everybody to look it up. It can be scientifically proven and justified. It's actually a process that happens in our brains when we build habits. The brain, we're building neural pathways in our brains. And building these habits, it just takes time. Building a habit like drinking a glass of water every morning maybe only takes 30 days. Learning how to drive a car. But getting familiar or believing into such controversial topics or lies takes much longer and is repetitive. And what they do is they come and get you with a subjective truth, a personal truth, something that resonates with you, that is really true to you, and they become a trusted source. And then they raise the level. All extremist groups do that, including QAnon and so on, and Proud Boys and all of these groups. The next level, they raise the level a little bit, and then at the end you have, like, for example, the Jewish world conspiracy. The other panelists said it with George Soros, for example. You go down the rabbit hole, all of a sudden you end up with Rockefeller, Rothschild, and Protocols of the Elders of Zion, and with the Jewish world conspiracy. And it takes time, and therefore it also takes time, the de-radicalization process. And therefore, we have this phenomenon in society where say it's too little too late when somebody's changing. For example, even people storming the Capitol, and some people have wrote back and said, oh, maybe it was stupid what I did there. And all of a sudden everybody says, oh, that's too little, it's too late. Well, the problem is if it would be too little, too late, I wouldn't be here today. If you walk 10 miles into a forest, it takes 10 miles to walk out. So we need to give people a chance to change, give them the time and allow them to change. It is tricky. But getting back to the report, Thank you again for mentioning that. And yeah, there is in radicalization, there's different backgrounds. You have like in this ensemble of white supremacists, you had a much higher level of adverse childhood experiences, childhood trauma that we could find there. Dysfunctional families, where a sense of belonging is created, and the form of identity this is missing. What am I doing here? And these groups come and they offer you this alternative, this identity. They come, again, like I said, with this subjective truth. It resonates, and then they raise the level. Also, what happens in this radicalization process, very often they come with, it's always us versus the other. And very often at the end stands the ultimate enemy, which is very often the Jew in the Jewish world conspiracy. And first you have only like minority groups, the immigrants, it's the communists, but they're all led by this overpowerful group. And this goes slowly there. We had another report, you can look it up, it's called Directed Hate, where it describes this process, where they go from all these minority groups, it always goes directed to that overpowerful group that it's leading it. And of course, you have in these groups, you have actually a high percentage of people that are actually that you can count to the LGBTQ community that are in denial, and when they come out, they come out. They have a double coming out, you know, and admit actually I'm bisexual, I'm gay, I'm transgender, I'm non-binary, whatever all there is, what they're identifying as. And they suppress that. And sometimes it's also, you've seen that with that one shooter in Florida who shot up a gay bar or something. He was gay himself, was in denial, and hated something he wasn't allowed to be. And this is very similar in this too. And then you also have like that cult following, and you have seen it with QAnon, the cult following a leader. In this case, it was Trump. Or you have it, follow your leader. You've seen it, Hitler was the same thing. And it's very personal often. Once this leader is gone, the group falls apart. I will post the link to the report in the chat room so everybody can download it. And of course, and then you have, when it comes to radicalization, you have these different categories. Some people are born into that environment. I worked with people, third generation Klansmen. They came to census and finally broke that legacy. Or other people, neo-Nazis who raise their kids that way. It's horrible to look at this. Or just people that get radicalized in the environment. It could be either religious, that's people like that are in the KKK often. They justify the hate with the Bible in groups like Christian Identity, and also the jihadist groups have the same approach. And often then you have the political approach. And very often, like in case of skinheads, that we don't see that much today anymore, but it was big in the 80s and 90s. It was a subcultural gang approach. And then you have a hybrid like the National Socialist movement that is out there. And since their leader is gone, they're pretty much dying down too, fortunately. That was also a little bit of a cult situation for 20 years. So, and of course, also capitalizing using mainstream media. And you have seen that Alex Jones, for example, very good at that. And a lot of white supremacists try to do the same thing, capitalize on that. And Oath Keepers, the Oath Keepers leader is a good example for that, cashing in into their members. And they try it again and again, even you speak out against that. And then we have, of course, another identifier that is really important is tattoos as an identifier. That has changed a little bit with the alt-right, where you had a lot more college kids, educated kids coming into these movements and said, hey, we need to get rid of the bald heads, we need to get rid of the Klan robes, we need to get rid of the tattoos, and we have to get this in the mainstream. Actually, an approach David Duke tried since the 70s, and it was pretty unsuccessful, and it came actually with social media and Richard Spencer, that we have this alt-right situation. And of course, then we have these crossovers that we've seen actually like in Charlottesville, where you have the alt-right, this new approach, meeting the old approach, and these unholy alliances again. So I'll post the link to the report in the chat. And that's also very interesting about doxing, and exposing can be counterproductive. That's also mentioned in there. So those are really important.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much. Rick Legault. And I also want to just reiterate that we're going to be finishing at 1 o'clock. And while Rick's talking, we'll post this survey about the coalition that we mentioned at the beginning if you're interested in participating.
Thanks, Laura. I'm going to be super brief. Something that I've heard that's recurring here in across all of these talks today that has been really thought-provoking for me has been the idea of social stratification in all of its various forms, and in-group and out-group dynamics. I've moved my giant head aside because one of the photographs that I keep on the wall behind me in my office is photographed by a guy named Frankie Quinn, who is famous for photographing Northern Ireland. And one of the photographs is actually a photo of a peace wall separating a Protestant and Catholic neighborhood, which still stand in Ireland today. I've been to Northern Ireland. I can't differentiate between Protestants and Catholics, but they sure can. Right? They don't look like each other at all. And I think we all know the level of violence that happened there over time that was politically motivated. Radicalization is a difficult topic, as I remind a lot of my European colleagues and other international colleagues when we work together. We don't think about that the same way in the United States as other people do. I think it's important to remember that this country, the United States, was founded by people who were radical and violent in their time, and were described as terrorists by the British. So it's really difficult, right? And that makes policy very difficult. And that's one of the reasons why we focus so much on criminality and violence resulting from extreme ideas, and we really don't focus at all on policing ideas. That being said, ideas can be harmful and motivate people to crime and violence, and those types of things aren't protected. We've been funding systematic reviews of evidence on a lot of these topics recently at the Department of Homeland Security, and I've provided links to a whole bunch of those recent reviews that have been published that are publicly available in their library on the Q&A. And then another thing I saw come up in the Q&A that I think is really thought-provoking, and I just recently went back to, I haven't looked at it in years and years and years, is a book called The Open Society and Its Enemies by Karl Popper that he wrote after escaping Europe in 1945. It's a really interesting book about tolerance and open speech and open societies and intolerance. From a great, brilliant person. I think Karl Popper's work was excellent. So I think that's important. I also think, and we should all lobby for this, there should be a dedicated sarcasm app that is, or font that is searchable, so that we know what is a joke and what isn't, because people have severely underdeveloped senses of humor, and it's a primary way in which sarcasm is a primary way of communication among some people. I've been accused of that myself. I can't thank the presenters enough for their insight in their work in this area, and I thought the whole day has been brilliant, and I'm very grateful to have been a part of it. And I hope some of the links that I posted might be helpful to some of the people here. Thank you, Laura, and thanks everybody who made this happen.
You are welcome. With 3 minutes left, Georges, do you have anything you'd like to add?
Just to remind us all that that this radicalization process is not a secret. It's clearly in the public view, and the new tools we have to communicate with one another, to engage one another, have allowed radicalization to grow at a rate that is substantial, and to some degree it's very open and very visible, but in other ways it's very silent, because a individual who is susceptible to this kind of programming can sit in their room on their computer sit in the back of the classroom and become radicalized. And then the family members say, how did this happen so suddenly, when it really wasn't sudden at all? And I just think that we're going to talk about prevention tools tomorrow, but just recognizing that there are several phases to where we can intervene. And I think there is a public health approach to helping people intervene in this process. But the most important thing is recognition and looking for it. In the inner city in Chicago, where I grew up, parents were always worried about their kids joining gangs, and they knew what to look for. I think one of the things we really got to do is equip family members, colleagues, friends on what to look for, and help identify people who are at risk.
Thank you so much, Georges. And that opens up for the plug. If you're interested in being part of a community that is looking for ways to help stop this process, please fill out the survey that was posted in the chat, because we're collecting names and emails of people who want to be part of a coalition. We're not quite sure what they'll look like yet, but the participants will help guide that. And with all that said, I'd like to thank everyone for your presentations and your thoughtful comments. This has been really more than I could have asked for. I wish we had more time for Q&A, but hopefully panel floor tomorrow will take care of that. Well, instead of starting at 8:30 tomorrow, we'll open the webinar at 8:45, and I'll give a very brief introduction, and we'll start the third panel right at 9 o'clock. So I look forward to seeing you all again then. And in the meantime, I hope you have a great rest of the day. Take care. Goodbye.